Good evening, dear friends. Make yourself comfortable, pour your tea, settle in, and do forgive me if tonight I seem in rather better spirits than usual. There is a reason for that. After last night's darkness at the church, and I do hope you've recovered, detective, because I confess I have not entirely, St. Mary Mead needed fresh air, sunlight, something uncomplicated. The village, it seemed, agreed, because on Saturday the 29th of March, the entire population of St. Mary Mead turned out for the first cricket match of the season. Saturday afternoons in an English village have a rhythm: tea at 3, cricket at 2, and very occasionally murder at 4:30. I should tell you, detective, that tonight's tale is a lighter one. There will be laughter. There will be cucumber sandwiches. Colonel Bantry will make a fool of himself at least twice, and Mrs. Bantry will enjoy every moment of it. But I want you to watch carefully, because the clue, the real one, the one that matters, will pass you by if you are watching the wrong thing. And 200 people were watching the wrong thing, every single one of them, all except Miss Marple. She was watching the right thing. She always does. Now then, let us begin. The village green at St. Mary Mead occupied a rough triangle of land between the Church of St. Michael, the post office, and the lane that led to Gossington Hall. It was not a grand ground. The pitch was uneven in places, the boundary rope had been mended with baling twine, and the pavilion, a wooden structure of considerable age and uncertain structural integrity, leaned slightly to the left in a way that had become, over the decades, a point of local pride rather than concern. On the morning of the 29th, the green had been transformed. White lines marked the crease. A row of folding chairs appeared along the eastern boundary, each one a declaration of status. The front row for the Bantry's doctor, Simmons and the vicar's wife, the second for the respectable middle, the third for those who brought their own cushions and expected nothing. Beyond the chairs, blankets spread on the grass where the young sprawled and the children ran in circles, accomplishing nothing with great enthusiasm. At the northern end, the scoring box, a table, a chair, and a wooden board with brass numbers on hooks waited beneath the chestnut tree. At the southern end, beside the stumps, stood the umpire's chair. It was a folding canvas affair, striped in green and white, with a cup holder screwed to one arm. It was empty. Its owner had not yet arrived. The flags of St. Mary Mead Cricket Club, red and white, somewhat faded, hung limp in the still air. There was no breeze. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, the kind of sky that promises nothing and delivers warmth by accident. From somewhere behind the pavilion came the sound of a kettle being filled, and from the lane the crunch of gravel as the first cars arrived. It was, by any measure, a perfect afternoon for cricket, and for murder, as it turned out, though that came later, and nobody was expecting it. Colonel Bantry arrived at 1:30, 40 minutes before the first ball was due, wearing a blazer he had not worn since 1948 and an expression of military readiness entirely disproportionate to the occasion. "Dolly," he said, turning to his wife with the air of a man surveying a battlefield, "we'll sit front row, left of the pavilion, better angle on the leg side." Mrs. Bantry lowered her sunglasses and regarded the village green with the calm detachment of a woman who had been married to Colonel Bantry for 37 years. "Arthur, it is a cricket match, not a la mine." "Front row," he repeated, and marched off to secure 2 chairs with the determination of a man who had once secured a bridge at Arnhem, or at least claimed to have been nearby when someone else did. Mrs. Bantry settled herself, produced a novel from her bag, and opened it at the bookmark. She had no intention of watching cricket. She had every intention of watching the people watching cricket, which was, as she had told Miss Marple on more than one occasion, considerably more entertaining. The teams arrived in stages. St. Mary Mead's 11 emerged from the pavilion, in whites of varying cleanliness, young Arthur Crabtree scrubbed and pressed, Tom Riggs with grass stains already on his knees from the warm-up, old Mr. Garfield moving with the caution of a man whose back had opinions about fast bowling. Much Benham arrived by charabanc, 9 players and a dog, the dog belonging to their wicket-keeper and displaying more enthusiasm for the occasion than several of the players. Tom Riggs was 24, red-haired and bold-fast, fast for St. Mary Mead, which meant moderately paced by any other standard, but with a ferocity of intent that compensated for what he lacked in technique. He had a temper. Everyone knew about the temper. His mother had once described it as passionate, which was generous. Mrs. Price Ridley had described it as common, which was not. Arthur Crabtree was 19, thin, and batted with a seriousness that suggested he believed the future of England depended on his cover drive. He had been practicing in his garden since February, to the despair of his mother's daffodils. And then there was Gerald Hewitt. He arrived at 10 minutes to 2, walking from the direction of the post office with the measured pace of a man who had timed the journey precisely and saw no reason to vary it. He was 67. He had been a schoolmaster at the village school for 31 years before his retirement, and he had umpired the street. Mary Mead cricket matches for 20 of those years. He was thin, upright, and possessed a face that looked as though it had been designed for the sole purpose of saying, "Not out," long, impassive, and untroubled by doubt. He carried, as he always did, a brown leather flask in his jacket pocket. "Gerald," said Colonel Bantry by way of greeting. "Colonel," said Hewitt by way of reply. This exchange, which constituted approximately the full extent of their social relationship, satisfied both parties entirely. Hewitt walked to the umpire's chair, placed his flask in the cup holder, folded his jacket over the back, and stood by the stumps, waiting. He did not chat with the players. He did not wave to the crowd. Gerald Hewitt was not a man who waved. Nobody noticed Mrs. Pendleton arrive. She came from the direction of the church carrying a canvas bag and a folding stool she did not need, since the scoring box already had a chair. She was 53, though she dressed as if she were older, in a gray cardigan and a skirt that had been practical in 1949 and remained practical in the way that only skirts nobody looks at can remain. She settled herself at the scoring table, opened her ledger, and uncapped her pen. Had anyone been watching, and nobody was, they might have noticed that she glanced briefly toward the umpire's chair before she sat down. But the look lasted half a second and contained nothing that would have interested anyone who was not Miss Marple. Miss Marple herself arrived at 5 minutes past 2, assisted by nobody, carrying a tapestry bag containing her knitting, a thermos of tea, and a small cushion for the chair. She took a seat in the second row, slightly to the right, where the angle gave her an unobstructed view not of the pitch, but of the crowd. She did not watch cricket. She had never watched cricket. She watched people, and a cricket match was merely the occasion for 200 of them to sit in one place and reveal themselves. The first ball was bowled at 17 minutes past 2, Much Benham batting. Tom Riggs ran in from the northern end, arm wheeling, and delivered a ball that swung late and missed everything, batsman, stumps, and wicket-keeper, by a comfortable margin. Colonel Bantry groaned. Mrs. Bantry turned a page. The early overs passed without incident. Much Benham batted cautiously. St. Mary Mead bowled with more enthusiasm than accuracy. The crowd settled into the particular rhythm of village cricket. Polite applause for a boundary, sympathetic murmuring for a dropped catch, absolute silence during Tom Riggs's run-up, not out of respect, but because his face, when interrupted, was not one that invited repetition. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. She was not watching the ball. She was watching Gerald Hewitt, who stood at the bowler's end with his hands clasped behind his back, and she was watching the people who were not watching him, which was everyone. Between overs, Hewitt sat in his chair and drank from his flask. He did this with the regularity of a mechanism, 3 sips, cap replaced, flask returned to the cup holder. Nobody paid attention. An umpire, between overs, is perhaps the least interesting object on a cricket ground. Less interesting than the roller. Less interesting than the sight screen. Certainly less interesting than Mrs. Price Ridley's hat, which had arrived at 2:30 and dominated the third row with an authority the hat's owner would have envied had she been capable of distinguishing between admiration and alarm. Colonel Bantry leaned forward in his chair, elbows on knees, following every ball with the intensity of a man who had once, in 1936, he would tell you, and frequently did, taken 3 wickets in a single over for the regimental 11. "He's bowling too short," he announced to nobody in particular. 6 inches fuller and he'd have had him. Arthur, said Mrs. Bantry, without looking up from her novel, you have not bowled a cricket ball since before the war. Muscle memory, Dolly. It never leaves you. Neither does your opinion, sadly. It was the 14th over that changed everything. Tom Riggs was bowling to Much Benham's number 4, a heavy-set man named Patterson, who batted as though the ball had personally offended him. Riggs ran in, faster now, face set, arm high, and the ball pitched on middle stump, straightened, and struck Patterson on the front pad with a sound that carried to the boundary. Riggs spun on his heel. Both arms went up. How's that? The appeal was enormous. It was, in fact, less an appeal than an announcement. Riggs stood with his arms raised, eyes locked on Gerald Hewitt, every line of his body expressing absolute certainty that the batsman was out, that the laws of cricket demanded it, and that any other decision would constitute a personal affront to justice, to bowling, and to Tom Riggs specifically. Gerald Hewitt, standing 6 feet from the stumps, tilted his head very slightly to the left. He considered the trajectory. He considered the point of impact. He considered whether the ball would have hit the stumps, which is what the law requires, and which is, in the case of an LBW decision, a matter of judgment rather than certainty. Not out, he said. The silence lasted approximately 1.5 seconds. Not out? Riggs's voice cracked on the second word. Not out? Are you blind? The whole ground heard it. The decision, said Hewitt in the voice of a man who had said the decision perhaps 4,000 times in 20 years, is not out. It was plumb. Ask anyone. Ask Colonel Bantry, he saw it. Colonel Bantry, who had indeed seen it, and whose own assessment was violently in favor of out, had the good sense to say nothing, though his mustache twitched in a way that communicated volumes. The decision is final, said Hewitt. He turned back to the stumps. Riggs stood in the middle of the pitch, chest heaving, fists clenched. For a moment it seemed he might say something that would result in consequences more serious than the loss of a wicket. Then Arthur Crabtree, who was fielding at mid-on, walked over and put a hand on his arm. Tom, leave it. I'll have his head for this, said Riggs. He said it quietly, which was worse than if he had shouted. 20 years of bad decisions, and this is the last one. I'll have his head. He said it loudly enough for the front 3 rows to hear, and quietly enough that he could later deny it, and in exactly the tone that, 6 hours later, Constable Polk would write down in his notebook with the word threatening underlined twice. Mrs. Price Ridley, in the 3rd row, drew a sharp breath and stored the sentence in the filing cabinet of her mind, where it would remain perfectly preserved until the moment it could do the most damage. Mrs. Bantry closed her novel. This was more like it. Colonel Bantry turned to his wife. The boy's right, you know. It was plumb LBW. Arthur, a man has just publicly threatened the umpire, and your concern is the decision? Well, it was out. Damn it. Miss Marple, in the 2nd row, had not looked at Tom Riggs. She had not looked at Gerald Hewitt. She had not, in fact, looked at the pitch at all. She had been looking at someone else, someone whose reaction to the commotion had been not anger, not amusement, not alarm, but a perfect and practiced stillness, the stillness of a person who has learned, over many years, not to be noticed. But Miss Marple noticed. She always did. The tea interval arrived not a moment too soon. The players left the field in a loose procession, Much Benham's batsmen with the cautious satisfaction of men who had survived Tom Riggs's bowling, Saint. Mary Mead's fielders with the slightly dazed expression of men who had spent 40 minutes chasing a ball in directions they had not anticipated. Tom Riggs walked off last, alone, his jaw set and his eyes fixed on a point approximately 6 inches above Gerald Hewitt's head, which was the closest he could come to looking at the man without saying something he would later regret. Or perhaps not regret. It was difficult to tell with Tom Riggs. The tea table had been laid out beneath the pavilion awning by Mrs. Dobbs and her committee, a phrase that Mrs. Dobbs used with authority and that referred in practice to Mrs. Dobbs and whichever 2 women she had persuaded, coerced, or shamed into helping. There were sandwiches, cucumber, egg and cress, and ham, arranged in descending order of social aspiration. There were scones. There was a Victoria sponge that Mrs. Dobbs had baked at 6 o'clock that morning and was now defending from wasps with a determination bordering on violence. And there was tea, enormous quantities of tea, in 2 urns, one marked strong and one marked not as strong, a distinction that owed more to Mrs. Dobbs's personal philosophy than to any measurable difference in brewing time. Mrs. Bantry stationed herself beside the sponge, which was the social center of any tea interval, and held court. "Well," she said, addressing the semicircle of women who had gathered with the instinct of villagers who sense gossip the way dogs sense thunder. "That was dramatic, Mrs." Price Ridley arrived at the semicircle as though she had been summoned. "I heard every word, every single word. I'll have his head." Those were his exact words. "I have them here." She tapped her temple with one finger. "You have a great deal in there, Lucinda," said Mrs. Bantry. "One wonders how there is room." "It is a disgrace," said Mrs. Price Ridley, declining to notice. "That Riggs boy has always been trouble. His mother, a very sweet woman, but far too lenient, his mother allows him to carry on in the most extraordinary way. If his father were alive—" "His father," said Colonel Bantry, who had arrived for the ham sandwiches, "bowled even faster and had a worse temper. Splendid cricketer, though. Took 7 for 32 in the match against Lower Woodley in 39. Arthur, we are not discussing his father's bowling average. More's the pity." Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Dobbs with a smile, and settled at the edge of the conversation, where she could hear everything without appearing to listen. She held her cup in both hands and watched the green over its rim. Gerald Hewitt was sitting in his umpire's chair, alone, as he always was during intervals. He did not join the tea table. He had never joined the tea table in 20 years of umpiring. Whether this was principle, temperament, or a disinclination to eat Mrs. Dobbs's sandwiches was unclear. He sat upright, flask in hand, and looked at the pitch with the expression of a man reviewing a spreadsheet. Mrs. Pendleton left the scoring box and walked across the grass toward him. She carried a cup of tea and a single scone on a small plate. She walked without hurrying. Nobody watched her go. Why would they? She was Mrs. Pendleton. She brought tea. She kept the score. She had been doing both for 15 years, and in that time she had become as invisible as the sight screen, present, functional, and entirely beneath notice. She reached the umpire's chair and said something. Hewitt looked up. He took the cup. He said something in return. A sentence, no more. Mrs. Pendleton nodded, collected his empty flask to refill it, presumably from the urn, and walked back toward the scoring box. The entire exchange lasted perhaps 40 seconds. It was the most ordinary thing in the world, a woman bringing tea to a man in a chair. Mrs. Bantry, who had been watching Mrs. Price Ridley, described Tom Riggs's character deficiencies with the thoroughness of a woman compiling a dossier, did not see it. Colonel Bantry, who had found the ham sandwiches and was debating whether 3 constituted greed or merely adequate nutrition, did not see it. Tom Riggs, who was sitting in the pavilion with his head in his hands and his resentment in full bloom, did not see it. Miss Marple, who was watching the green over the rim of her teacup, saw it. She saw Mrs. Pendleton walk to the chair. She saw her hand Gerald Hewitt the cup. She saw her take the flask. She saw her return. And she noticed, because Miss Marple always noticed, that the flask Mrs. Pendleton carried back was held not loosely, as one holds a thing one intends to refill, but carefully, with both hands, as one holds a thing one has already filled. Miss Marple took a sip of her tea and said nothing. The bell rang for the second half, not an actual bell, but Mr. Garfield clapping his hands and calling, "Right then, gentlemen," in a voice that suggested he had been saying it for 40 years and had long since stopped expecting anyone to respond promptly. The players returned to the field. Street. Mary Mead were batting now, and Arthur Crabtree walked to the crease with the careful tread of a young man who believed that how he carried his bat mattered, and in a way that had nothing to do with cricket and everything to do with the 3 girls from the village who were sitting on the boundary blanket and not looking at him, which he interpreted correctly as a deliberate and significant act of not looking. Gerald Hewitt resumed his position at the bowler's end. He picked up his flask from the cup holder, unscrewed the cap, and took 3 sips. Cap replaced. Flask returned. The mechanism continued. The first overs of the second half were uneventful. Much Benham bowled tidily. Arthur Crabtree defended with an earnestness that turned every ball into a moral choice. The crowd, which had been energized by the tea and by Mrs. Price Ridley's comprehensive account of Tom Riggs's shortcomings, settled into a drowsy, sun-warmed contentment. Miss Marple knitted. Mrs. Bantry read. Colonel Bantry watched every ball as though his life depended on it, and Gerald Hewitt, between overs, sat in his chair and drank from his flask, and nobody looked at him at all. It was the 7th over of the second half, the 21st of the match, when Arthur Crabtree hit the 6. It was, by any account, a remarkable shot. Much Benham's opening bowler delivered a full toss on leg stump, a gift, the kind of ball that a batsman remembers and a bowler tries to forget, and Arthur Crabtree, who had been defending as though the pitch were mined, suddenly unfurled. He stepped forward, swung the bat in an arc that began somewhere near his left heel and ended somewhere above his right shoulder, and connected. The ball rose. It climbed. It passed over mid-wicket, over the boundary rope, over the heads of the 3 girls on the blanket, and landed in Mrs. Price Ridley's lap, which produced a sound that was half shriek and half vindication, as though the universe had finally confirmed her suspicion that cricket was a dangerous and irresponsible pursuit. The entire village green erupted. Every head turned. Every pair of eyes followed the ball. Colonel Bantry was on his feet, arms raised. Mrs. Bantry put down her novel. The children screamed. Tom Riggs in the outfield was grinning for the first time that afternoon. Arthur Crabtree stood in the crease, bat raised, trying very hard not to look at the boundary blanket. 200 people watched the ball sail over the rope. Not one of them watched Gerald Hewitt. He was sitting in his chair. His flask was in his hand, the cap unscrewed. His head was tilted forward very slightly, in a way that might have been weariness or the sun or the particular heaviness that comes over a man of 67 on a warm afternoon after too much tea. Mrs. Pendleton, in the scoring box, hung a brass 6 on the board. The applause faded. The bowler walked back to his mark. The next ball was bowled, and the match continued. It continued for 2 more overs. Much Benham bowled. St. Mary Mead batted. The score advanced. The shadows lengthened. And Gerald Hewitt sat in his chair with his chin on his chest and his flask in the cup holder and the particular stillness of a man who was not sleeping. It was Arthur Crabtree who noticed first. He was standing at the non-striker's end, waiting for the over to begin, when he glanced toward the umpire's chair and saw that Hewitt had not stood up. The umpire stands between overs. He walks to the other end. He takes up his position. It is the rhythm of the game, as fixed and predictable as the tides, and Gerald Hewitt had performed it 4,000 times without variation. He was not performing it now. "Mr. Hewitt," said Arthur. "Mr. Hewitt, we're ready?" Gerald Hewitt did not move. "He's dozed off," said the Much Benham bowler, grinning. "Someone prod him." "Mr. Hewitt—" Arthur walked closer. The batsman at the other end leaned on his bat and watched with mild interest. In the stands, Colonel Bantry checked his watch. Mrs. Bantry looked up. Arthur Crabtree reached the chair. He touched Gerald Hewitt's shoulder. The flask slipped from the cup holder and landed on the grass with a soft thud. A small amount of tea, pale, lukewarm, faintly sweet-smelling, spilled onto the ground. Arthur pulled his hand back. He stood very still. His face, which had been open and boyish and flushed with the success of his 6, went white. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then said, in a voice that carried further than he intended, I think you'd better call Dr. Simmons." There was a pause. The particular pause that falls over a place when a sentence has been said that cannot be unsaid, when the afternoon has cracked, and the thing beneath it, the cold thing, the real thing, has begun to show through. Colonel Bantry stood up. "What's the matter? What's wrong with him?" "I don't know, sir. He isn't—" Dr. Simmons was already moving. He was a man of 60, compact and brisk, who had spent 30 years in general practice and possessed the ability, common to good doctors and good poker players, of crossing a room without appearing to hurry. He reached the umpire's chair in what seemed like 3 steps. He did not touch Gerald Hewitt immediately. He looked at the man's face. He looked at his hands. He looked at the flask on the grass. Then he touched 2 fingers to Gerald Hewitt's neck, held them there for 5 seconds, and withdrew them. "I'm afraid," said Dr. Simmons, in a voice pitched for the players and not the crowd, "that Mr. Hewitt is dead." The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then it broke. "Dead?" Colonel Bantry's voice carried to the boundary rope. "Dead? What do you mean, dead?" "I mean, Colonel, that he has died." "But he can't have died. He was umpiring. He was sitting right there. We were all watching." Nevertheless, Mrs. Bantry arrived at her husband's elbow with the speed of a woman who has spent 37 years anticipating the moments when Colonel Bantry will need either restraint or information, and who has learned that both are best delivered simultaneously. "Arthur, stop shouting. Dr. Simmons, is it his heart?" Dr. Simmons looked at the flask on the grass. He looked at the faintly sweet-smelling tea soaking into the earth. He did not pick it up. "I don't think," he said carefully, "that it was his heart." The transformation was immediate. The village green, which 5 minutes ago had been a cricket ground, festive, sunlit, strung with flags, became something else. The white boundary ropes, which had marked the limits of play, now marked the limits of something more serious. The folding chairs, which had been arranged for comfort, now seemed too close together, too exposed. The children were taken away. The sandwiches sat untouched, the wasps inheriting them at last. Someone, Mr. Garfield probably, because Mr. Garfield always did the things that nobody asked him to do, pulled a tarpaulin from the pavilion and covered Gerald Hewitt's chair with it, which had the effect of making the thing more terrible, not less, because a covered shape is always worse than a visible one. "I said it would end badly," said Mrs. Bantry, surveying the scene with the expression of a woman who derived no pleasure from being right, but who was nevertheless right. "Not precisely this badly, mind you. I was thinking more of a broken arm, or possibly a fist fight, but badly." "The match," said Colonel Bantry. He stopped. He looked at the covered chair, at the pitch, at the scoreboard where Mrs. Pendleton's brass number still hung, St. Mary Mead 94 for 3. "I suppose the match is Arthur." "Well, we were winning, Dolly. Arthur Dorian Bantry. The full name." Colonel Bantry recognized the full name. He closed his mouth. Tom Riggs was standing in the outfield, alone, his arms hanging at his sides. He had not moved since Dr. Simmons's announcement. His face was the color of the pavilion wall. He was remembering, with the sudden and devastating clarity that follows a death, the exact words he had said 3 hours earlier, and the exact number of people who had heard them. I'll have his head for this. His head. Every eye in the village green that was not looking at the covered chair was looking at Tom Riggs. Mrs. Price Ridley was already speaking. She was speaking to Mrs. Dobbs, who did not want to hear, and to Mr. Garfield, who could not avoid hearing, and to the air itself, which received her words with the indifference of long experience. "I said it at the time. I said those exact words. 'Mark my words,' I said, 'that boy will do something. And now look, now look.'" Miss Marple, in the second row, had not stood up. She had not moved to the umpire's chair. She had not joined the gathering crowd, or spoken to Dr. Simmons, or offered an opinion. She sat with her knitting in her lap and her hands folded over it, and she watched. She watched Colonel Bantry commanding everyone and no one. She watched Mrs. Price Ridley distributing blame with the efficiency of a postal service. She watched Tom Riggs standing alone in the outfield, white-faced and silent. She watched Mrs. Hewitt's empty chair by the boundary. The wife had not come to the match today. She watched the pavilion and the tea table and the scoring box where Mrs. Pendleton sat with her pen still in her hand and her ledger still open, as though she were waiting for the match to continue. And she watched the tarpaulin-covered chair beneath which Gerald Hewitt sat in the particular stillness of a man who would never give another LBW decision, and who had, in the course of an ordinary Saturday afternoon, become the most watched person in St. Mary Mead, which was ironic, Miss Marple reflected, because for the 67 years prior to this moment, he had been among the least. Forgive me for interrupting, Detective, but I want you to consider something. 200 people came to the village green that afternoon. They came to watch cricket. They brought chairs and blankets and sandwiches and flasks of tea. They sat in rows and on the grass facing the pitch, and for 2.5 hours they watched a ball travel back and forth across 22 yards of mown grass. 200 people, every one of them with eyes. Every one of them facing the same direction, and not one of them, not the colonel, who missed nothing on the field, not Mrs. Price Ridley, who missed nothing off it, not Dr. Simmons, who was trained to observe, not even Mrs. Bantry, who was the sharpest woman in 3 parishes, not one of them saw Gerald Hewitt die. How? Because they were all watching the same thing, and when 200 pairs of eyes are pointed at the same object, a red leather ball, a running bowler, a swinging bat, the rest of the world ceases to exist. The umpire between overs, sitting in his chair, drinking from his flask, is as invisible as the grass beneath their feet. He is part of the scenery. He is the frame, not the picture. He is, in the most literal sense, not worth watching. We were all watching, Detective. That was precisely the problem. It is a strange thing, how presence can become absence, how a man can die in the middle of a crowd and the crowd not notice, because the crowd was looking at something more interesting. A cricket ball, a 6 over mid-wicket, a boy's arm swinging. We watch what moves, what entertains, what excites. We do not watch what serves, what waits, what sits quietly in a folding chair. Miss Marple did not watch the cricket. She never has. She watches the watchers. And the watchers, Detective, are always more interesting than the game. I hope you are watching too. The clue, the real one, has already appeared. If you caught it, well done. If you didn't, stay sharp. There is more to come, and if you are watching for the first time tonight, welcome to our little mystery family. Do subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss tomorrow's tale. It is, I promise you, rather different from this one. Now, let us return to the village green, where the police have just arrived. The police, when they arrived, considered something rather more straightforward than paradoxes. Constable Polk came from market basing on a bicycle, which was not, perhaps, the most commanding entrance a representative of the law might make, but which was consistent with a Saturday afternoon in a rural constabulary, when the sergeant was at his sister's wedding, and Inspector Slack was dealing with a burglary in Much Benham that had turned out to involve a goat and a quantity of disputed cheese. Polk was 26, earnest, and in possession of a notebook that he opened with the reverence of a man who believed that the written word was the foundation of justice, and who had not yet learned that most of what people told policemen was either inaccurate, self-serving, or both. He dismounted at the gate, removed his bicycle clips, and surveyed the village green with an expression that said, very clearly, that he had been trained for this at Hendon and that he remembered approximately 60% of the training. Right, he said. Who found the body? I did, said Arthur Crabtree, who was sitting on the pavilion steps looking as though he wished he had not. He was in his chair. He didn't get up. Polk wrote this down. He wrote it slowly and completely, including the word chair and the word up, because Constable Polk believed in completeness. And who is the deceased? Gerald Hewitt, said Colonel Bantry, who had appointed himself liaison to the police without consulting anyone. Umpire, retired schoolmaster, lived on Vicarage Lane, 67 years old, good man, reliable, terrible conversationalist, but reliable. Polk wrote this down too. He paused at terrible conversationalist, looked at it, and moved on. Doctor. Simmons provided the medical facts. Hewitt had been dead, in his estimation, for approximately 30 to 45 minutes before Arthur Crabtree had touched his shoulder. The symptoms were consistent with poisoning, the faintly sweet smell from the flask, the absence of obvious trauma, the particular color of the deceased's lips. The flask would need to be tested. Poisoning, said Polk, and the word landed on the village green like a stone in a pond. The ripples were immediate. Mrs. Price Ridley drew herself to her full height, which was not considerable, but which she deployed with maximum effect. Mrs. Dobbs clutched the remains of the Victoria sponge as though it were a life raft. And Tom Riggs, who had been sitting in the outfield staring at nothing, got slowly to his feet and began walking toward the gate, which was exactly the wrong thing to do if one wished to avoid the attention of a young constable who had read about suspicious behavior in his training manual and was keen to identify it in the wild. "Sir," Polk's voice had a crack in it, "sir, I'll need you to stay on the grounds." Tom Riggs stopped. He turned. "I wasn't leaving. I was walking. Nevertheless, sir, nobody leaves until I've taken statements." This was, in retrospect, an ambitious declaration, given that nobody encompassed approximately 200 people, many of whom had already left, several of whom had not been paying attention, and at least one of whom, Mrs. Price Ridley, would require no encouragement whatsoever to give a statement of virtually unlimited length. "Now then," said Polk, flipping to a fresh page with the determination of a man beginning an examination for which he had revised the wrong subject. "I understand there was an altercation, during the match, between the deceased and," he consulted his notes, "a Mr. Riggs." "It wasn't an altercation," said Riggs. His voice was tight. "It was a disagreement, about a decision. It happens in cricket. You said, and I have this from multiple witnesses, I'll have his head for this. It's a figure of speech. It is also," said Polk, writing, "a threat. I didn't poison the man. I was angry about an LBW. Half the ground was angry about the LBW. Ask Colonel Bantry." Polk looked at Colonel Bantry. Colonel Bantry coughed. "Well," he said, "it was out. Plumb, but that's neither here nor there." "Arthur," said Mrs. Bantry. "What? I'm providing context. The boy's right about the LBW, even if he's wrong about everything else." "I'm not wrong about anything." Riggs's voice rose. His hands were shaking. "I didn't do anything. I bowled. I appealed. He said not out. I said some things. That's all. I was in the outfield for the entire second half. Ask anyone. I was 50 yards from his chair. 50 yards. Polk wrote 50 yards and underlined it, though it was unclear whether this was because he found the distance significant or because he had developed the habit of underlining things that were said loudly. "The flask," said Polk. "Did you have access to the deceased's flask at any point?" "His flask? Why would I touch his flask?" "Because, Mr. Riggs, the flask appears to have been the means by which the poison was administered." "I bowl. I don't serve tea." Mrs. Price Ridley, who had been hovering at a distance, calculated to convey both respectful deference to the police and absolute availability as a witness, chose this moment to intervene. "Constable, if I may. I have known that young man since he was a boy, and I have always said that he would come to grief. His temper is quite ungovernable. I heard him, we all heard him, threaten Mr. Hewitt in the most explicit terms. Mark my words, Constable, mark my words." "Thank you, madam," said Polk, who had already marked them and would have been grateful for fewer of them. "And furthermore, thank you, madam, Mrs." Bantry, who had been watching this exchange with the expression of a woman deciding whether to intervene for reasons of justice or entertainment, decided, "You always say a great deal, Lucinda. Most of it after the fact." Mrs. Price Ridley turned to her with the slow precision of a turret gun. "I beg your pardon? You heard the boy say a foolish thing, and now that something terrible has happened, you are making it mean more than it did. Half the men at this match have said worse about umpires over the years. Arthur has threatened to horsewhip every umpire between here and Danebury, and none of them have come to harm." "I have never threatened to horsewhip anyone," said Colonel Bantry, with the wounded dignity of a man who had, in fact, threatened to horsewhip several people, but felt that the distinction between intention and capability was important. "You threatened Mr. Mortimer in 1953. That was a joke, Dolly." "So, I suspect, was Tom Riggs." Polk, whose notebook was filling rapidly with material that would not advance his investigation but would provide excellent reading at the station, attempted to reassert control. "I'll need statements from everyone in the front 3 rows, and from anyone who approached the deceased during the tea interval." He said this with confidence. He said it as though he believed it would be straightforward. It would not be straightforward. While Constable Polk was asking Tom Riggs where he stood, Miss Marple was asking a different question. She was sitting in her chair in the second row. She had not moved, not once, since the discovery, with her knitting in her lap and her teacup balanced on the armrest. Mrs. Bantry, returning from her skirmish with Mrs. Price Ridley, sat down beside her with the satisfied air of a woman who has said exactly what needed to be said and who expects recognition for it. "Well, Jane, what do you think?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She was watching Mrs. Pendleton. The score was still in her box, still at her table, though her pen was capped now and her ledger closed. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, looking at nothing. She had the particular composure of a person who has been overlooked so many times that she has forgotten what it feels like to be looked at. "Dolly," said Miss Marple, in a voice that was conversational and mild, and that gave no indication whatsoever of the direction it was about to take, "who brought Gerald his tea during the interval?" Mrs. Bantry frowned. "His tea? What do you mean?" "During the tea interval. Someone walked across the green and brought him a cup of tea, and took his flask." Mrs. Bantry thought about it. She had been standing by the Victoria sponge. She had been talking to Mrs. Price Ridley, which was to say, she had been listening to Mrs. Price Ridley and inserting corrections at intervals. She had not been watching the umpire's chair. "I didn't see." "Why?" "Nobody saw," said Miss Marple. "That is exactly what interests me." Mrs. Bantry looked at her friend. She had known Jane Marple for a very long time, long enough to recognize the particular quality of mildness that preceded a revelation, the way calm water precedes a drop. "You saw." "I was not watching the cricket." "You never watch the cricket." "No, I watch the people who are not being watched. They are, as a rule, considerably more interesting." Mrs. Bantry waited. Miss Marple adjusted her knitting needles. "I find myself wondering," said Miss Marple, "about where people sit at a cricket match. Not the spectators, we all know where they sit and why and what it means. But the others, the scorer, the umpire, the woman who lays the tea. Where do they sit, and who watches them?" "Nobody watches them, Jane. That's rather the point of them." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Yes, it is, and that, I think, is rather the point of this." She said nothing more. She returned to her knitting. Mrs. Bantry, who had survived enough of these conversations to know that pressing Jane Marple for clarity was as productive as pressing a cat for an apology, picked up her novel and pretended to read it. But she was not reading. She was thinking about tea and flasks and who walks across a cricket ground with a cup and a scone for a man that nobody watches. The umpire's wife arrived at 6:30. Mrs. Hewitt came by taxi from Market Basing, where she had been visiting her sister, a fact that Constable Polk verified with the sister and with the taxi company and with the sister again, because Constable Polk believed in thoroughness the way some men believe in religion, devoutly, conspicuously, and with an unshakable conviction that it would eventually lead to salvation. She was 59. She wore a gray coat and a hat that she removed upon entering the pavilion where the body had been moved, or rather where the chair had been moved, Gerald Hewitt still in it, because Dr. Simmons had insisted he not be disturbed until the pathologist arrived, and the pathologist was driving from Melchester and would be at least another hour. Mrs. Hewitt looked at the covered chair. She did not cry. She did not sit down. She stood in the doorway of the pavilion with her hat in one hand and her handbag in the other, and she looked at the tarpaulin with an expression that was difficult to read, not because it contained too many emotions, but because it seemed to contain too few. "When did it happen?" she said. "During the second half, madam," said Polk, "approximately 4:30. "I see." She paused. "Has anyone notified Mr. Pendlebury, the solicitor? Gerald's affairs were handled by Mr. Pendlebury. There are arrangements to be made." Colonel Bantry, who had remained in the pavilion out of a sense of duty and an inability to be anywhere important without being present, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "My dear Mrs. Hewitt, there's plenty of time for all that. Dreadful shock. Can I get you anything? Tea?" "No, thank you, Colonel." She looked at the tarpaulin again. "Did he suffer?" It was the second question, not the first. Miss Marple, who was standing at the pavilion entrance, she had walked there when the taxi arrived, slowly, with her tapestry bag, as though she had merely wanted fresh air, heard both questions. the order of them, the solicitor before the suffering. She noticed. She filed it. She did not judge it. A woman who has lived with a pedant for 40 years may simply be practical. A woman who asks about the will before asking about the pain may be cold, or she may be a woman who already knows the answer to one question and needs the answer to the other. Miss Marple had seen both kinds. She had seen a third kind, too, the kind who asks about the will, because the will is the only thing that will change, because the husband has been the same for 40 years, and death is merely the final expression of a temperament that was already immovable. Mrs. Hewitt sat down on the bench outside the pavilion. She folded her hands in her lap. She answered Constable Polk's questions with the precision of a woman married to a man who valued precision, times, dates, routines. Gerald rose at 7. He prepared his own breakfast. He prepared his own flask, always. Earl Grey, 2 sugars, filled at 1:30 before leaving for the match. He had done this for 20 years. Nobody touched his flask. Nobody? Said Polk. Nobody. Gerald was particular. Polk wrote particular in his notebook. He underlined it. It seemed to Polk like the sort of word that might matter later, though he could not yet say why. Mrs. Hewitt remained at the pavilion for 40 minutes. She identified the body. She answered questions. She did not cry. When the taxi returned to take her home, she stood, put on her hat, and walked to the car with a step that was neither hurried nor slow, but simply the step of a woman who was leaving a place where she no longer needed to be. Colonel Bantry watched her go. "Brave woman," he said. Said Mrs. Bantry. "What does mean?" "It means, Arthur." By evening, Constable Polk had his theory. It was, he felt, a good theory. It was supported by evidence, by witnesses, and by the satisfying narrative coherence that young policemen mistake for truth. A man is insulted. A man makes a threat. A man carries out the threat. Beginning, middle, end. Polk had read about Occam's razor in his training manual, and he was quite sure this was it, the simplest explanation, the one that required the fewest assumptions, the one that pointed with the inevitability of a compass needle at Tom Riggs. The evidence: Riggs had publicly threatened the deceased. He was known to have a violent temper. He was a bowler. He had been at the bowling end, close to the umpire's chair, for the first half of the match. He had motive. He had proximity. He had, in Polk's opinion, the look of a man who had done something and was trying very hard not to look like a man who had done something, which Polk found suspicious, and which was, in fact, merely the look of a man who had said a stupid thing in public and was now watching it be used against him. The flask was poisoned, Polk explained to Colonel Bantry and Mrs. Bantry and Dr. Simmons, who had gathered in the pavilion, as a kind of informal advisory board that nobody had requested and that Polk had not the authority to dismiss. Dr. Simmons confirms poisoning. The flask was the vehicle, and Riggs had both motive and opportunity. "Opportunity?" said Dr. Simmons, who was cautious by training. "He was 50 yards away for the entire second half. But not for the first half. He was bowling at the umpire's end. He was standing 6 feet from the chair between overs. He could have, I'll grant you I'm still working out the mechanics, but he could have dropped something in the flask." "With 14 fielders, 2 batsmen, and 200 spectators watching him?" said Mrs. Bantry. "Nobody was watching the flask, madam. That's the point." "Nobody was watching anyone near the flask, Constable. That is a rather different point." Polk regarded Mrs. Bantry with the faintly hunted expression of a man who has prepared his argument and is discovering, too late, that the audience is not the one he prepared for. "With respect, madam, the evidence points to Riggs. He threatened the man, in public. I'll have his head." Those were his exact words. Mrs. Price Ridley materialized from the direction of the tea-table, where she had been waiting for precisely this moment with the patience of a heron and the timing of a trap. "Those were his exact words, Constable. I have them here." She tapped her temple again. "Exact. I said at the time, I said to Mrs. Dobbs, who will confirm, mark my words, that boy will do something. And now look." "Thank you, Mrs." "Price Ridley," said Polk. "I also noted the time, 4:17, and the number of witnesses, at least 40 in the immediate vicinity, though I can provide a more precise "Thank you, Mrs. Price Ridley. And furthermore, his mother, a very sweet woman, but thank you." Mrs. Bantry caught Miss Marple's eye across the pavilion. Miss Marple was standing by the door, her hands on her tapestry bag, her expression mild and attentive and entirely unhelpful, which was, Mrs. Bantry knew, the expression Jane Marple wore when she disagreed with everything she was hearing and had no intention of saying so until she was ready. Miss Marple said nothing. But when Miss Marple said nothing, it was a very particular kind of nothing. It was the nothing of a woman who had heard the wrong answer given with great confidence, and who was waiting not impatiently, not angrily, but with the quiet certainty of a woman who knows that the right answer will arrive in its own time, because it always does. Constable Polk was satisfied. He had a suspect, a motive, a weapon, and a notebook full of statements. He would file his report. The pathologist would confirm the poison. Tom Riggs would be questioned further, and then, Polk felt certain, the case would be resolved. He was wrong, of course. But Miss Marple was thinking about seating arrangements. She was sitting in the second row again. The crowd had thinned. The green was emptying. The shadows were long and blue on the grass, and she was looking at the places where people had been. The front row of chairs, Colonel Bantry, Dr. Simmons, Mrs. Cartwright, the vicar's wife. The second row, Miss Marple herself, Mrs. Foster, Mr. and Mrs. Garfield. The third row, Mrs. Price Ridley and her hat. Behind the chairs, blankets on the grass, the young people, the children. Along the western boundary, the players' families, the Much Benham supporters, a few men from the pub who had wandered over to watch and stayed to drink beer from bottles they thought nobody noticed. All of them, every single one, facing the pitch, facing the batsman, the bowler, the ball. Their attention pulled by movement, by sound, by the ancient and irresistible magnetism of a game in progress. For 2.5 hours, 200 people had looked at the same 22 yards of mown grass, and in doing so, they had rendered the rest of the ground invisible. But there were people on the rest of the ground. Gerald Hewitt, in his chair. Between overs, sitting, drinking, invisible. Mrs. Pendleton in the scoring box, hanging brass numbers, writing in her ledger, invisible. Mrs. Dobbs, behind the tea table, cutting sandwiches, defending sponge cake, invisible. The people who made cricket possible, the people who served, the frame, not the picture. Miss Marple thought about frames. She thought about pictures. She thought about the fact that in 40 years of observing village life, the most important things had almost always happened in the frame, in the margins, in the background, in the spaces that nobody watched because nothing interesting was supposed to happen there. A girl stealing from the church collection, a gardener burying something at dawn, a wife putting something in her husband's tea. None of them had been center stage. All of them had been in the frame. And today, at the cricket match, something had happened in the frame. Something that 200 pairs of eyes had failed to see, because 200 pairs of eyes had been pointed at a red leather ball. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, placed it in her tapestry bag, and stood up. The green was almost empty now. The chairs were being folded. The tarpaulin-covered shape in the pavilion was being attended to by the pathologist, who had finally arrived from Melchester with the apologetic air of a man who had misjudged the traffic. She looked at the scoring box. It was empty. Mrs. Pendleton had left quietly at some point during the police interviews, and nobody had noticed her go. Nobody ever noticed Mrs. Pendleton. Miss Marple noticed. She walked quite casually toward the scoring box. The scoring box was a modest affair, a trestle table, a folding chair, the brass number board on its wooden frame, and a canvas awning that had been white once and was now the color of English summers, which is to say, a faintly defeated gray. Mrs. Pendleton's ledger was still on the table, closed, her pen placed neatly beside it. A thermos stood at the corner, her own, not the umpire's. A cardigan hung over the back of the chair. Mrs. Pendleton had not gone far. She was standing behind the scoring box at the edge of the chestnut tree's shadow, holding a canvas bag and looking at the green with the expression of a person who is waiting for permission to leave, but who has not been told she needs permission and therefore cannot ask for it. Mrs. Pendleton, said Miss Marple, arriving with the unhurried step of a woman who has no particular purpose, and who therefore does not need to explain herself. "I do hope they haven't kept you too long." "Oh, no, not at all. The constable took my statement. There wasn't much I could tell him, I'm afraid. I was keeping the score, you see. I didn't really see anything." She smiled. It was the kind of smile that apologizes for its own existence. "Of course," said Miss Marple. "The score. You've been doing it for some time, haven't you?" 15 years, since Mr. Pettigrew retired. He did it before me. I offered. Well, nobody else wanted to, really. It's not very exciting. Just numbers." "And you enjoy it?" Mrs. Pendleton considered this as though the concept of enjoyment were slightly foreign, not unpleasant, merely unfamiliar. "I like being useful. It's a nice afternoon out and someone has to do it. Gerald always said—" She stopped. The name hung in the air. "Mr. Hewitt," she corrected, and the correction was quick and careful, and one syllable too late. "Mr. Hewitt always said the scoring was important, that the match didn't count without a proper record. He sounds like a man who valued precision." "Oh, he was. Very precise. Very correct. Everything had to be just so. The rules, you know. He was very firm about the rules." Miss Marple nodded. She looked at the scoring table, the ledger, the pen, the thermos. She looked at the 3 yards of grass between the scoring box and the spot where the umpire's chair had stood. 3 yards. Close enough to pass a cup of tea. Close enough to reach a flask. "You brought him tea during the interval," said Miss Marple. It was not a question. Mrs. Pendleton's hands tightened on her canvas bag. The movement was small, a contraction of the fingers, a whitening of the knuckles, and it lasted less than a second. Yes, I always do. Did. He didn't come to the tea table, so I brought him a cup and a scone. It was nothing, it's what I do." "How kind," said Miss Marple. "Anyone would. And yet nobody else did. In 15 years. Mrs. Pendleton looked at her. It was a brief look, not alarmed, not defensive, but the look of a person who has been seen, suddenly and unexpectedly, by someone she had assumed was not looking. The look lasted a moment. Then Mrs. Pendleton adjusted her canvas bag on her shoulder and smiled the apologetic smile again. "Well," she said, I ought to be going. If the constable doesn't need anything else." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "Good evening, Mrs. Pendleton." Mrs. Pendleton walked away across the green. She walked without hurrying. She did not look back. Miss Marple stood at the scoring box for a long moment. She looked at the ledger. She looked at the 3 yards of grass. She looked at the cup holder on the arm of the umpire's chair. The chair had been moved to the pavilion, but the indentation in the grass where it had stood was still visible. 4 small squares where the legs had pressed down for 2.5 hours. Then she turned and walked back toward the Boundary, where Colonel Bantry was helping Mr. Garfield fold chairs with the aggressive efficiency of a man who needed something to do with his hands. It was Colonel Bantry who provided the missing piece, though he did not know it and would not have recognized it if someone had labeled it and placed it in his hand. "Arthur," said Miss Marple, settling herself on the one remaining unfolded chair with the calm authority of a woman who understood that the last chair belongs to the person who needs it most, and that she was that person. "When Gerald sat down between overs, did anyone approach him?" Colonel Bantry straightened up. A folding chair dangled from one hand. He thought about it. He thought about it the way Colonel Bantry thought about everything, quickly, confidently, and with the absolute certainty of a man who did not doubt his own observations, which was admirable in a soldier and unfortunate in a witness. Approach him? During the match? During the match, between overs, when he sat in his chair. Well, Mrs. Pendleton came over once or twice, I think, asked about the score or brought him something. She always does, nobody else. You're quite sure? Quite sure. Who would bother with the umpire? Between overs, the man was wallpaper. No offense to the dead, but Gerald Hewitt sitting in a chair was not a spectacle that attracted company. "No," said Miss Marple softly. "No, it wouldn't be." "Why? What does it matter who approached him?" "Because Gerald's flask was clean when he left home. Mrs. Hewitt confirmed it. He prepared it himself every match day. Earl Grey, 2 sugars, filled at 1:30. Always his ritual. If the flask was poisoned, it was poisoned after he arrived at the green. Colonel Bantry put the folding chair down. He looked at Miss Marple. "You mean someone put something in his flask during the match?" "During the match, between overs, while 200 people watched a cricket ball." "But nobody was near his chair. I just told you, only Mrs. Pendleton, and she was only—" He stopped. Miss Marple said nothing. She did not need to. Colonel Bantry was not a subtle man, but he was not a stupid one, and the arithmetic of the situation, 1 flask, 1 chair, 1 person who approached it, 200 people who did not, was not complicated. "Oh," he said. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "But Mrs. Pendleton, Mildred Pendleton, she's nobody. She keeps the score." "Yes," said Miss Marple again. "She does." Colonel Bantry stood among the folded chairs and the flattened grass and the lengthening shadows, and he looked at the spot where the scoring box had been, and he looked at the spot where the umpire's chair had stood, and he measured the distance between them with his eyes, and he found it very short indeed. "Good God," he said. "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "we should sit down. I think Mrs. Bantry should hear this too." Miss Marple sat in the garden of Gossington Hall that evening, a cup of tea balanced on the arm of her chair, and the last light of the day turning the laurel hedge a deep liquid green. Mrs. Bantry was beside her, feet tucked under her on the garden bench, her novel abandoned on the table between them. Colonel Bantry had been dispatched indoors to telephone Constable Polk, a task he had accepted with the gravity of a man entrusted with a mission and the speed of a man who wished to be present for the explanation and feared missing it. "It reminds me," said Miss Marple, folding her hands in her lap, "of old Mrs. Trotter's cat." Mrs. Bantry waited. She had heard a great many of Miss Marple's village analogies over the years, the laundryman's wife, the butcher who overcharged, the curate's handshake, and she had learned that the connection between the analogy and the murder was never obvious, frequently improbable, and invariably correct. "Mrs. Trotter had a cat," said Miss Marple, "a gray cat, very quiet, the sort of cat that sits on a chair and becomes the chair. You would walk into Mrs. Trotter's kitchen and not see it. You would sit down and not see it. You would eat your lunch and not see it, and then the cream would disappear. Every day the cream. And Mrs. Trotter blamed the milkman, the children, the weather, everything except the cat, because she had forgotten the cat was there. Jane, you cannot compare Mrs. Pendleton to a cat. I am comparing her to someone nobody watches. There is a difference, and it is rather important." Miss Marple took a sip of tea. "For 15 years, Mildred Pendleton has sat 3 yards from the umpire's chair. She has brought Gerald Hewitt tea. She has recorded his decisions. She has been present at every match, every over, every interval. And not one person on that green, not you, not Arthur, not Dr. Simmons, not Mrs. Price Ridley with her extraordinary powers of observation, has ever watched her. Not once. Because there was nothing to watch. Because she made sure there was nothing to watch. That is not the same thing." Mrs. Bantry pulled her cardigan tighter. The evening air had a chill in it now, the kind of chill that arrives in late March when the sun drops below the trees and the day remembers suddenly that it is not yet spring. "But Jane, why? Mrs. Pendleton is the most harmless woman in the village. She has no enemies. She has no— I can't even imagine what she would have against Gerald Hewitt. He was a bore and a pedant, but he wasn't cruel." "Was he?" Miss Marple set her teacup down. "That," she said, "is the question." The story, when she found it, was 12 years old. It came in pieces, the way village stories always come, not as a single narrative, but as fragments retrieved from different memories, each one incomplete, each one shaped by the teller's position and prejudice and the particular quality of their attention. Miss Marple collected the pieces over the course of the evening, speaking to Dr. Simmons on the telephone, to the vicar's wife, who stopped by Gossington Hall for a sherry she had not been offered but accepted with gratitude, and to Mrs. Bantry herself, who remembered more than she thought she did once the right questions were asked. Dr. Simmons provided the medical context. He had been the village doctor for 30 years, and he knew everyone's secrets, not because they told him, but because illness strips pretense, and a man who has seen his patients at their weakest knows them more honestly than a man who has seen them at their best. Mildred Pendleton, he said, choosing his words with a doctor's habitual caution. A quiet woman. Lived alone since her mother died. That would be, 14 years ago. 15. She helped at the church. She kept the cricket score. She is the sort of person who volunteers for everything and is thanked for nothing. And her connection to Gerald Hewitt? A pause. He was her teacher at the village school. Years ago she would have been, 12, 13? He taught there for 30 years before he retired. Everyone in the village under 50 was taught by Gerald Hewitt. But there was something more. Another pause. Longer. There was, I shouldn't say. It was a long time ago. Miss Marple waited. She was very good at waiting. She had once waited 45 minutes for a robin to leave a flower bed so she could see what it had been standing on, and it had been a button from a dead man's coat, and the patience had been worth it. 12 years ago, said Dr. Simmons, there was a discrepancy in the church accounts. A small amount, £15. It was during the Restoration Fund, you'll remember, the roof. Money came in from various sources, and the accounts were managed by a committee, the vicar, Mrs. Price Ridley, Gerald Hewitt, he was treasurer, very precise about it, and Mildred Pendleton, who did the bookkeeping. £15 went missing. £15 was unaccounted for. There was no accusation, you understand. No formal inquiry. The vicar was horrified at the very idea. Mrs. Price Ridley was suspicious, naturally. She is suspicious of the weather, but nothing was said publicly. The discrepancy was quietly resolved. An anonymous donation of £15 appeared in the collection plate the following Sunday. And Gerald Hewitt knew who had taken it. Gerald Hewitt was the treasurer. He audited the books himself, every entry, every receipt. If there was a discrepancy, he found it, and if he found it, he would have known exactly who was responsible. Miss Marple, I am not saying, no, of course not. But she did not need Dr. Simmons to say it. The vicar's wife, over her unsolicited sherry, filled in the rest, not directly, but through the accumulated detail of 15 years of parish observation. Mildred is a treasure, she said, with the particular enthusiasm that people reserve for those they rely upon and do not think about. She does the flowers on alternate Saturdays. She runs the jumble sale. She types the parish newsletter. She does everything, really. Gerald used to say she was indispensable. He used to say, "Where would we be without Mildred?" He said it rather often, actually. And she did all this willingly? Oh, yes. Mildred never complains. She never says no. If you ask her to do something, she does it. Gerald, Mr. Hewitt, relied on her particularly. She brought his tea at the cricket. She typed his letters for the parish council. She ran errands. She was his score, wasn't she? In every sense. Miss Marple sat very still. She was seeing something, not a single image, but a pattern, a 15-year pattern, drawn in cups of tea and parish newsletters, and brass numbers hung on a scoring board. A woman who had taken £15 in a moment of desperation, perhaps her mother's illness, perhaps a bill, perhaps the particular humiliation of a woman who helps everyone and can afford nothing, and who had been seen, not caught, not reported, not punished, seen, by a man who valued precision, a man who remembered every rule, every infraction, every error, a man who did not shout, did not accuse, did not threaten, a man who simply knew, and who, knowing, asked, "Will you bring the tea, Mildred? Will you keep the score, Mildred? Will you type the letters, Mildred? Where would we be without Mildred?" 12 years of small requests, 12 years of quiet compliance, not blackmail, nothing so crude, nothing so nameable. Gerald Hewitt had never asked for money. He had never made a threat. He had simply known, and his knowing had turned Mildred Pendleton into a servant, not by force, but by the gentle, relentless pressure of an obligation that could never be repaid and could never be forgotten, because the man who held it would never forget. It was not cruelty. That was the worst of it. Gerald Hewitt had not been cruel. He had been precise. He had seen an error in the ledger, and he had corrected it, not with a pen but with a person. He had turned a woman's worst moment into a permanent debt, and he had collected on it every Saturday afternoon for 12 years, 1 cup of tea at a time. "It reminds me," said Miss Marple very quietly to Mrs. Bantry, who was sitting in the darkening garden with her sherry untouched and her face pale, "of the arrangements one sometimes sees between people who have lived too close for too long. Not love, not hatred, something worse than either. A transaction without a contract, without an end, without the possibility of refusal. Because the debt is never stated, and therefore can never be paid." £15, said Mrs. Bantry. £15, Jane. The amount was never the point. The knowing was the point. And the knowing lasted 12 years. And she, Mildred, she just endured it? Until she didn't. She asked Constable Polk to return. He came on the bicycle again, though this time he left the bicycle clips on, which gave his arrival the faintly harassed quality of a man who has been interrupted during supper and expects to be sent back to it shortly. He was not sent back to it shortly. He was shown into the drawing-room at Gossington Hall, where Miss Marple sat in a chair by the fireplace, and Mrs. Bantry sat on the sofa, and Colonel Bantry stood by the mantelpiece, because Colonel Bantry did not sit during briefings, which was how he had classified this meeting in his mind, and which was, in fairness, not entirely inaccurate. "Miss Marple," said Polk, with the careful politeness of a young man who has been told by his sergeant that elderly ladies are sometimes useful, and who has filed this information in the same mental drawer as advice about shoe polish and the correct angle for a salute, theoretically sound, practically untested. "Colonel Bantry said you had something to share." "I do," said Miss Marple. "I think, Constable, that you have arrested the wrong person." Polk's notebook was already open. He looked at it as though the notebook might offer guidance, which it did not. "I haven't arrested anyone yet, Miss Marple. I've detained Mr. Riggs for further questioning." "Then you may release him. He did not kill Gerald Hewitt." "With respect, Miss Marple, the evidence points to a man who said something foolish in a temper about a cricket decision. The evidence of the murder points elsewhere." Polk looked at Colonel Bantry, who shrugged the shrug of a man who has learned, over 37 years of marriage, that it is sometimes better to let other people be right. Polk looked at Mrs. Bantry, who raised her eyebrows in a way that communicated, with remarkable economy, that he should sit down and listen. Polk sat down. Miss Marple began with the flask. "Gerald Hewitt prepared his own flask every match day. Earl Grey, 2 sugars, filled at 1:30. His wife confirmed this. He carried it to the green, placed it in the cup holder on his chair, and drank from it between overs. This was his habit for 20 years. The flask was his. Nobody touched it. Which is why Riggs must have... Constable. Tom Riggs was bowling from the northern end during the first half. He was, as he told you, at the bowling end, but the bowler does not approach the umpire's chair between overs. He walks to his fielding position. The umpire sits in the chair at the boundary. The bowler stands at fine leg, or mid-on, or wherever his captain has placed him, 50 yards away. Riggs did not approach the chair. He could not have approached the chair without crossing the entire field in front of 200 people. Polk opened his mouth. "Moreover," said Miss Marple, with the gentle implacability of a river wearing through stone, "during the tea interval, Tom Riggs was in the pavilion. He was angry. He was sitting with his head in his hands. Arthur Crabtree was with him. Neither of them went near the umpire's chair. I saw them. I was watching. Then who? There is only one person who approached Gerald Hewitt's chair during the match. Only one person who was close enough to touch the flask, to open it, to add something to it. Only one person who had a reason to be there, a reason so ordinary, so expected, so invisible that nobody thought to mention it to you. Because it was what she always did. She? Mrs. Pendleton, the scorer." The name landed in the room like a teacup placed on a table, quietly, precisely, and with a small sound that was louder than it should have been. Polk stared. "Mrs. Pendleton? Mildred Pendleton? She keeps the score." "Yes. She sits 3 yards from the umpire's chair. She has done so for 15 years. She brought Gerald Hewitt tea during the interval, a cup, a scone, and she took his flask. She returned the flask. Nobody watched. Nobody watches the scorer, Constable. Nobody watches the woman who brings the tea. But why? What possible motive could Mrs. Pendleton have to poison Gerald Hewitt? She's a church volunteer. She types the newsletter. Miss Marple told him about the 15 pounds. She told it simply and without adornment, because the story did not need adornment. 12 years ago, a small amount missing from the church restoration fund, an anonymous donation to cover it. Gerald Hewitt, the treasurer, who audited every entry and knew exactly who had taken it. And then, not a confrontation, not an accusation, not a report to the police, something quieter, something worse. He never said a word about the money, said Miss Marple. He did not need to. He simply knew. And she knew that he knew. And from that day forward, Mildred Pendleton served Gerald Hewitt, brought his tea, kept his score, ran his errands, typed his letters, because she could not refuse. Because refusal would mean the question, why are you refusing? And that question would lead to the answer she could not afford to give. That's not blackmail, said Polk, frowning. He never asked for money. No, he asked for something more valuable. He asked for her time, her labor, her presence, her obedience, and he asked for it in ways that looked to everyone else like kindness. Where would we be without Mildred? He said it often. The vicar's wife told me. He said it with a smile, Constable, and Mildred smiled back, because what else could she do? The room was quiet. The fire crackled. Colonel Bantry, who had been standing very still at the mantelpiece, cleared his throat but did not speak. 15 pounds, said Mrs. Bantry from the sofa. 12 years for 15 pounds. The amount was never the point, Dolly. The knowing was the point, and the knowing had no expiration. It would have continued. The tea, the scoring, the errands, the quiet servitude, until one of them died. Miss Marple paused. Mrs. Pendleton decided which one. Polk was writing. He was writing quickly now, the way a man writes when the thing he is recording has overtaken his ability to process it. He stopped. He looked up. But how? How did she do it? If the flask was in the cup holder. During the tea interval, she brought Gerald a cup of tea and a scone. She took his flask to refill it, presumably from the tea urn. This was what she always did. Nobody noticed, because nobody ever notices. She returned the flask to the cup holder before the second half began. Gerald drank from it between overs, as he always did. 3 sips, cap replaced, flask returned. The mechanism. And the poison? Was in the flask when she returned it, not in the cup she brought him. That was clean, a gesture, a reason to approach. The poison was in the flask. She had all of the tea interval to prepare it. She walked to the chair, exchanged the cup for the flask, walked to the scoring box, added whatever she had brought in her canvas bag, and walked back. 60 seconds, in full view of 200 people, none of whom were watching. Miss Marple looked at Constable Polk with an expression that was not unkind, but that contained, beneath its mildness, something that the young constable would remember for a long time, a clarity that made his own certainties feel small and temporary and built on sand. 200 people watched the cricket, said Miss Marple. Nobody watched the scorer. Polk closed his notebook. He opened it again. He closed it. I'll need to speak to Mrs. Pendleton, he said. Yes, said Miss Marple. I think you will. And Riggs? Release him. He said a foolish thing. Young men do. It does not make him a murderer. Polk stood. He looked at Miss Marple, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time that evening, seeing not an elderly woman in a chair, but something sharper and stranger and more formidable than anyone he had met at Hendon. How did you know? He said. Everyone was watching the match. How did you see? Miss Marple picked up her knitting. I was not watching the match, Constable. I never watch the match. I watch the people who are not being watched. She smiled. It was a small smile, the smile of a woman who had seen a great deal of human nature and who found it, on the whole, disappointing but not surprising, and occasionally, in the gap between what people showed and what they hid, rather interesting. Polk left. The bicycle clips were still on. When they had gone, the constable, the questions, the business of evidence and procedure, and the machinery of law that follows a revelation the way a cleanup crew follows a storm, Miss Marple sat alone. Mrs. Bantry had gone to make fresh tea, because Mrs. Bantry believed that tea was the appropriate response to all events, including murder, and Colonel Bantry had gone with her, because Colonel Bantry believed that being near Mrs. Bantry was the appropriate response to all events, including confusion, though he would not have phrased it that way and would have been embarrassed if someone had. The drawing room was quiet. The fire had burned low. Through the window, the garden was dark and still, and beyond it, the village green, empty now, chairs folded, ropes coiled, pavilion locked, lay under the first stars of the evening like a stage after the audience has left. Miss Marple looked at her hands. They were old hands, spotted, lined, the knuckles swollen. They were hands that nobody watched, not in a crowd, not in a room, not at a cricket match. She was, in her way, as invisible as Mildred Pendleton, an elderly woman in a chair, a woman who knitted, a woman who was present at everything and noticed by no one. The difference, of course, was what she did with the invisibility. Mildred Pendleton had endured hers until it became a weapon. Miss Marple had cultivated hers until it became an instrument. Both of them understood the same truth, that the people nobody watches are the people who see everything. She did not feel sorry for Gerald Hewitt. He had not been a villain, not in the storybook sense, not in the way that Tom Riggs was loud or Mrs. Price Ridley was vindictive. He had been precise. He had seen an error, and he had used it, quietly, methodically, without malice and without mercy, the way a schoolmaster corrects a sum, not because he enjoys the correction, but because the error offends him. And the correction had lasted 12 years, and had cost a woman her freedom and a man his life. She did not feel sorry for Mildred Pendleton either. Or perhaps she did, but the sorrow was the complicated kind, the kind that sits beside judgment without displacing it, the way two people can sit in the same room without agreeing. Mildred had stolen 15 pounds. Mildred had been trapped. Mildred had killed a man. All three things were true. None of them canceled the others. The worst is usually true. But the worst, Miss Marple reflected, is rarely simple. The village green was empty now. Mrs. Bantry returned with the tea tray and found Miss Marple standing at the window, looking out at the dark garden. She set the tray down, poured 2 cups, and handed one to her friend without comment, because the right kind of friend knows when conversation is needed and when a cup of tea is enough. They stood together at the window for a moment. The green was a dark shape beyond the hedge, featureless, the scoring box invisible, the umpire's chair long since removed to the pavilion, and from there to the coroner's van. "It will be a different score next season," said Mrs. Bantry eventually. "Yes." "And a different umpire." "Yes." "And nobody will think about it. The match will be played. Someone will bowl too fast and appeal too loudly, and someone else will bring the tea and keep the score and sit 3 yards from the umpire's chair, and nobody will watch." "No," said Miss Marple. "Nobody will watch." Colonel Bantry appeared in the doorway, holding a tumbler of whiskey with the air of a man who has decided that tea is insufficient. "Damn shame about the match," he said. Mrs. Bantry turned to him. "Arthur." I know. But Dolly, we were winning. 94 for 3. That's 6 of Arthur Crabtree's. A man is dead, Arthur." Colonel Bantry looked into his whiskey. He looked at the window. He looked at the dark green beyond it. "Yes," he said. "Yes, he is." He paused. "But it was a very good 6. Arthur Dorian Bantry. I'm going to bed." He went to bed. Mrs. Bantry watched him go. She turned to Miss Marple. There was a silence, the good kind, the kind that exists between people who have been friends long enough that silence is a shared language rather than an absence of speech. "Tomorrow's Sunday," said Mrs. Bantry. "Church. Mrs. Price Ridley will have the entire parish informed by the first hymn. Before the first hymn, I should think. Almost certainly. Mrs." Bantry picked up her teacup. "Jane, do you ever get tired of it, of seeing things that other people don't?" Miss Marple considered this. "Not tired," she said. "Occasionally rather sad. Human nature is very consistent, Dolly. It does not improve with observation, but it does become comprehensible. And comprehension is a kind of comfort, I think. Even when the thing comprehended is not comfortable at all." She set down her cup. "I should go home. My cat will be expecting me." "Your cat has no expectations, Jane," He is a cat. He expects supper. That is expectation enough. Mrs. Bantry walked her to the door. The night was cool and clear, the stars sharp, the lane to Miss Marple's cottage silver in the moonlight. A quiet night. A village night. The kind of night that makes you believe the world is safe and ordered, and that nothing terrible could possibly have happened on a Saturday afternoon on a village green where the score was 94-3, and the tea was strong, and the scones were warm, and the umpire sat in his chair and did not get up. And so, dear friends, we come to the end. A cricket match, a flask of tea, a woman nobody watched, and a man who sat in a folding chair and became, in death, the most observed person in St. Mary Mead, which is a strange kind of fame, and not, I think, the kind he would have wanted, though it is difficult to say what Gerald Hewitt wanted, because Gerald Hewitt was a man who kept his wants to himself and imposed them on others through the mechanism of knowing. I hope you did better than Constable Polk, Detective. Most of you, I suspect, guessed it before he did. The clue was there, in the 6th chapter, if you were counting, when a woman walked across a cricket ground with a cup and a scone and a flask that nobody watched her take. If you caught it, well done. If you didn't, well, neither did 200 other people, so you are in excellent company. Tonight's mystery was a lighter one, as I promised. There was laughter. There was Colonel Bantry, who will forgive me for saying so, being entirely himself. There was cricket, which I do not pretend to understand, but which seems to bring the English a kind of happiness that is indistinguishable from suffering, and which I admire from a safe distance. But underneath the laughter, underneath the sandwiches and the sponge cake and Mrs. Price Ridley's hat, there was something rather less comfortable. A woman who served, a man who watched, and a debt that was never spoken, never acknowledged, and never paid until it was paid with poison in a flask on a Saturday afternoon. We never watch the people who serve us. We never think about the woman who brings the tea, the man who sweeps the floor, the scorer who hangs the brass numbers on the board. They are the frame. We look at the picture. Miss Marple looks at the frame. That is why she sees. Tomorrow we rest, but not entirely. A quiet Sunday, a woman called Mrs. Partridge, and a rumor that should never have left her kitchen. I must warn you, Detective, tomorrow's tale is not lighter. It is, I think, rather darker. A word, spoken once over a garden fence that traveled through St. Mary Mead like a flame through dry grass, and at the end of it, a funeral. But that is tomorrow. Tonight, rest. You have earned it. If you enjoyed this evening's mystery, do let me know in the comments, and tell me, who did you suspect? Was it Tom Riggs with his temper? Mrs. Hewitt with her questions about the will? Or did you see what Miss Marple saw, the quiet woman in the scoring box 3 yards from the chair, holding a flask that nobody watched her fill? Subscribe if you haven't already, and ring the bell. New mysteries every evening at 6. Welcome to our little mystery family. We are glad you are here. Rest well, Detective. Tomorrow's case may be darker still. Good night.